Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to trace the path from colony to conflict. We're going to break down how a whole century of foreign rule and, a pretty fiery revolution literally split Vietnam in two. This created the fault lines for a war that, it would define an entire generation.
Okay, so if we really want to understand the war that basically shaped the 20th century, we've got to rewind. Way past the headlines, past all the Hollywood movies. See, before America ever got involved, the Vietnamese were already fighting a long, brutal war for their own independence. So the real question is, who were they fighting against?
So our story really kicks off back in the late 1800s. France swoops in, seizes control of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and mashes them all together into this one big colonial territory they called French Indochina. And, let's be super clear about this. This was no partnership. It was a straight-up conquest.
What the French set up here was, it was a textbook case of imperialism. The whole point of the colony was to make France richer and more powerful. It was all about extracting wealth from the land and from the people, with, basically zero regard for the locals.
And for the Vietnamese people, this wasn't some abstract idea. It had brutal, real-world consequences, every single day. Think about it. Their natural resources, like rubber and rice, were just shipped off to Europe. They were hit with these crushing taxes. They were forced into something called corvée labor, which is just a fancy term for forced unpaid work. And any pushback, any local traditions, any calls for self-rule, ruthlessly suppressed. It wasn't just unfair, it was deeply humiliating.
So after decades of this kind of treatment, you can imagine, there's this simmering pot of resentment just ready to boil over. It was the absolute perfect breeding ground for a nationalist movement, right? A fight for independence that was just waiting for a leader to light the fuse. And that leader, his name was Ho Chi Minh.
Now, Ho was a really fascinating guy. He leaves Vietnam as a young man and spends years traveling the world, seeing the great powers from the inside. We're talking France, the US, even the Soviet Union. And he's watching, he's learning. He sees their strengths, but he also sees their hypocrisies. And he's really drawn to this promise of communism, this idea of liberating oppressed people everywhere. So when he finally returns, he's got a new name, a new ideology, and just one single laser-focused goal: Vietnamese independence.
And to make that happen, in 1941, he creates this revolutionary organization, the Viet Minh. The mission was incredibly simple, but so powerful. Unite all Vietnamese patriots, didn't matter what their politics were, and kick out all foreign rulers. That's a rallying cry an entire nation could get behind.
Okay, so fast forward to after World War II. France tries to just waltz back in and reclaim its colony, but this time the Viet Minh was ready for him. And what came next was the First Indochina War, a brutal, nearly decade-long struggle. You've got Vietnamese nationalists on one side and a modern European army on the other. It was a classic David versus Goliath story.
And these two sides, they couldn't have been more different. The French rolled in with tanks, planes, a traditional, conventional army. The Viet Minh, they had something else entirely. They had the people. They used guerrilla tactics, melting into the jungles, using their local knowledge, and they drew their strength from the peasants to just slowly, methodically bleed the French forces dry. They called it a people's war.
And guess what? It worked. After 9 long, bloody years of fighting, it all came to a head with this legendary victory at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh did the absolute unthinkable. They defeated their colonial masters. France had no choice. They were forced to admit defeat and start negotiating their way out of Vietnam.
But here's the twist. Winning on the battlefield didn't mean they got a simple, unified, independent Vietnam. Oh no. The international community stepped in, and the solution they came up with? It created a brand new problem, one that was arguably even more dangerous.
So, at this big peace conference in Geneva, Switzerland, the world's major powers make a pretty fateful decision. They agree to temporarily, and I'm putting that in big air quotes, divide Vietnam right at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's forces would get the north, and a new non-communist government would be set up in the south. They promised, don't worry, we'll hold a national election in 2 years to put the country back together. Spoiler alert, that election never happened. And that temporary line? It became a very hard, very real border.
So, this was the new reality on the ground. Vietnam wasn't one nation fighting a colonial power anymore. Now, it was two rival states glaring at each other across a border.
You had the North, led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist government backed by the Soviet Union and China, and then you had the South, an anti-communist state with its own very powerful patron, the United States. The fight for Vietnam's future just became a major front in the global Cold War.
Which, of course, brings us to the next big question, right? France is finally gone. So why on earth did the United States feel the need to jump in and get so deeply involved? Well, the answer really boils down to a single, very powerful idea.
That idea was articulated perfectly by President Eisenhower, and it became known as the domino theory. It's a pretty simple concept, really. The fear was, if you let the communist North take over the South, if that first domino falls, it won't stop there. Next thing you know, Laos falls, then Cambodia, then Thailand. The thinking was that all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism, one after the other, just like a row of dominoes.
In this domino theory, it became the absolute bedrock of American policy in the region. The goal was simple: contain communism, stop it from spreading. The strategy? Prop up the new anti-communist leader in the South, a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem. And the action? Well, that was to pour in tons of money, military equipment, and advisors to build South Vietnam into a solid wall, a barrier to stop communism in its tracks.
And so the stage was set. You've got one nation finally free from colonial rule, but now it's violently split in two. You have two rival governments, each one armed and funded by a global superpower, and each one absolutely convinced that they are the rightful heir to the country's future. The Vietnamese people fought so hard to win their independence from France, only to find themselves on a collision course with each other and with the rest of the world drawn right into the middle of it. When you look at it all laid out like that, you just have to wonder, was a wider war truly inevitable? Was there any way to avoid what was coming next?